Before we dive into this emotional journey, I invite you to subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories that will touch your heart and soul. Now, let's begin a tale about family, truth, and the courage to face our deepest secrets. The June sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Church, casting kaleidoscopic patterns across Emily Matthews' white gown. At 48, Catherine Matthews watched her daughter from the front pew, her chest tight with pride and a hint of something else. Apprehension, perhaps, or the whisper of a long-buried secret. "You look perfect," Catherine had told Emily earlier that morning as she adjusted her daughter's veil, their reflections merging in the ornate mirror of the bridal suite. Emily, at 26, was the spitting image of Catherine in her youth. The same chestnut hair, the same delicate nose, the same determined chin. But her eyes, those were different. A vivid green that Catherine had always attributed to Emily's paternal grandmother. Now, as the church filled with the gentle melody of Pachelbel's canon, Catherine's gaze drifted to the empty space beside her, where her son, Thomas, should have been sitting. At 30, Thomas was perpetually late, another trait he'd inherited from his father, Robert. The thought of her ex-husband sent a chill down Catherine's spine, despite the warm June day. Robert Matthews had not been invited to the wedding. The divorce 15 years ago had been acrimonious at best, devastating at worst. He had disappeared from their lives almost entirely, surfacing only for the occasional birthday call to Thomas, never to Emily. That had been his choice, one that Catherine had long ago stopped trying to understand. The music swelled and the congregation rose as Emily began her slow procession down the aisle. Her arm was linked with her stepfather's, James, who had been more of a father to her than Robert ever was. Catherine caught her daughter's eye and smiled encouragingly, blinking back tears. Emily's fiancé, Daniel, waited at the altar, his expression a mixture of awe and adoration as he watched his bride approach. They made a striking couple, Emily with her classic beauty and Daniel with his tall, athletic build and earnest face. Catherine had grown fond of the young attorney over the 3 years he'd been with Emily. He was kind, ambitious, and clearly devoted to her daughter. The ceremony proceeded beautifully. The minister spoke of love and commitment, of weathering life's storms together. Catherine felt James squeeze her hand, and she returned the pressure, grateful for the 17 years they'd shared since finding each other in the aftermath of her divorce. It was during the minister's invitation for anyone who knew of any reason why the couple should not be joined in matrimony to speak now or forever, hold their peace, that traditional moment of silence that usually passed without incident, when the church doors banged open. Catherine didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She knew from the way the air suddenly seemed to leave the room, from the way her heart plummeted to her stomach, from the soft gasp that escaped Emily's lips. Robert Matthews stood in the doorway, his once handsome face flushed with what might have been alcohol or rage or both. 15 years had not been kind to him. His hair was thinner, his frame heavier, but the intensity in his blue eyes remained unchanged. "I have something to say," he announced, his voice echoing in the stunned silence of the church. Catherine rose from her seat, her legs trembling beneath her. "Robert, don't—" But he was already striding down the aisle, a manila envelope clutched in his hand. "Everyone here thinks they know this perfect little family," he said, his words slightly slurred. "The devoted mother, the successful daughter." He reached the front of the church and turned to face the congregation, his back to the altar where Emily stood frozen, her bouquet of white lilies trembling in her hands. "But it's all built on lies," Robert continued, his voice rising. "And I can't let this farce of a wedding continue without the truth coming out." Catherine moved toward him, her hand outstretched. "Please, not here. Not now." Robert ignored her, his gaze fixed on Daniel. "Do you know who you're marrying, young man? Did Catherine tell you?" He ripped open the envelope and pulled out several papers. "She isn't even her daughter." The collective gasp that swept through the church was audible. Emily's face drained of color. "Emily isn't my biological child," Robert announced, waving the papers in the air. "And Catherine has known all along. I have the DNA test results right here, results she's been hiding for years." Catherine's world narrowed to her daughter's face, the shock, the confusion, the dawning horror. "Emily," she whispered, but no sound came out. Daniel's expression had transformed from bewilderment to something harder, something Catherine couldn't quite read. He took a step back from Emily, his eyes darting between her and Robert. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Before Emily could respond, Robert thrust the papers at Daniel. "See for yourself. She's not a Matthews. Never was. Catherine's been lying to everyone for 26 years. The silence in the church was deafening as Daniel skimmed the documents, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing second. When he finally looked up, his eyes sought not Emily's but Catherine's. "Mrs. Matthews?" he asked. And in that question was a plea for denial, for an explanation, for anything that would make sense of the chaos that had erupted in what should have been the happiest moment of his and Emily's lives. Catherine opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. How could she explain here now, in front of 200 guests, what she had barely been able to explain to herself all these years? The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. And then, with a swift, decisive movement, Daniel handed the papers back to Robert and turned to Emily. "I can't do this," he said, his voice breaking. "Not like this. Not with lies." Emily reached for him, her veil slipping slightly. "Daniel, please." But he was already backing away, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Emily. I need time." And with that, he turned and walked down the aisle, past the stunned faces of their friends and family, past Robert, who stood with a triumphant gleam in his eye, and out the church doors into the bright June afternoon. Emily remained at the altar, her white gown gleaming under the church lights, her bouquet now hanging limply at her side. Her gaze found her mother's, a question in her tear-filled eyes that Catherine had no idea how to answer. The Matthews colonial home on Maple Street had always been a sanctuary, a place of Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, and the comforting rhythm of family life. But as Catherine entered through the front door, Emily trailing silently behind her, the house felt foreign, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. James had managed the exodus from the church, thanking guests, making apologies, promising explanations that he himself didn't have. Thomas had appeared sometime during the chaos late as usual, just in time to witness the devastating aftermath of Robert's announcement. He'd immediately taken charge of Emily, shielding her from well-meaning but curious guests, his arm protectively around his sister's shoulders as he led her to the waiting car. Now, in the stillness of the house, Emily slipped off her heels and stood in her wedding gown in the middle of the living room, looking lost. Her makeup, so carefully applied hours earlier, was streaked with tears, and her carefully styled hair had begun to come undone. "I'll make some tea," Catherine said, desperate for something to do, some normal action to ground her in this surreal situation. "I don't want tea," Emily said, her voice flat. "I want the truth." Catherine sank onto the sofa, suddenly exhausted. "Emily, I'm so sorry. This isn't how I wanted, so it's true," Emily interrupted, her green eyes, those eyes that had always been a mystery, boring into Catherine's. "I'm not Dad's daughter?" The front door opened before Catherine could respond, and Thomas entered, followed by James. Thomas immediately went to Emily, guiding her to sit down. "I called Daniel," he said gently. "He's at his parents' house. He said he needs time to think." Emily nodded mechanically, her gaze never leaving Catherine's face. "Tell me," she said, "all of it." Catherine looked at James, who nodded encouragingly as he took a seat beside her. His solid presence gave her strength, as it had for 17 years. "Yes," Catherine finally admitted, the word hanging heavy in the air. "Biologically, Robert is not your father." Emily closed her eyes, as if the confirmation was a physical blow. "Who then?" Catherine twisted her hands in her lap. "His name was David Winters. We knew each other in college before I met Robert. We had a brief relationship. When it ended, I didn't know I was pregnant. By the time I found out, I was already dating Robert." She paused, the memories flooding back. "We were so in love, Robert and I. When I told him about the pregnancy, he said it didn't matter, that he would love you as his own. And he did, for a while," Thomas added, his expression dark. "Until things started falling apart between you two." Catherine nodded. "The divorce was difficult. Robert felt betrayed in so many ways. He started drinking, became bitter. That's when he demanded the DNA test, even though he'd known the truth all along. I think he just wanted official proof, something to justify his anger." "But why didn't you tell me?" Emily asked, her voice breaking. "I had a right to know." Catherine reached for her daughter's hand, relieved when Emily didn't pull away. "You were 11 when we divorced, Em. You were already dealing with so much, the separation, moving to a new house, adjusting to life without Robert around. I couldn't bear to add another burden, to make you question your identity on top of everything else. And then, as time passed," James added gently, "it became harder to find the right moment. There's never a right moment to tell someone their entire life is based on a lie," Emily said bitterly. "Your life is not a lie," Catherine insisted, squeezing Emily's hand. "You are my daughter. You've always been my daughter. The circumstances of your conception don't change who you are or how much you are loved." Emily withdrew her hand and stood up, the voluminous white skirt of her wedding gown rustling. "I need to change," she said, "and I need to call Daniel." As she climbed the stairs to her old bedroom, her wedding dress trailing behind her, Catherine felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over her. She turned to Thomas, who had been uncharacteristically quiet. "Did you know," she asked, "about Robert's plan to come to the wedding?" Thomas shook his head, his expression troubled. "No, I haven't spoken to him in months, but—" he hesitated. "I did know about Emily, about David Winters being her biological father." Catherine stared at her son in shock. "How? When?" "Dad told me years ago, right after the divorce, during one of his weekend visits. He was drunk, angry, said I should know what kind of woman my mother really was." Thomas's voice was bitter. "I was 15, Mom. I didn't know what to do with that information, so I just kept it to myself." "All these years," Catherine whispered. Thomas nodded, looking ashamed. "I thought I was protecting Emily too, and you. But maybe I should have said something. Maybe if it had come from family instead of being announced like that, in front of everyone." James placed a comforting hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You were a child, put in an impossible position. None of this is your fault." "No," Catherine agreed. "The fault is mine. I should have told Emily the truth long ago." She looked toward the stairs where her daughter had disappeared. "I just hope she can forgive me." From upstairs came the sound of Emily's voice, muffled but clearly distressed, presumably on the phone with Daniel. Catherine closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 2 decades of secrets pressing down on her. "What about this David Winters?" James asked quietly. "Does he know about Emily?" Catherine shook her head. "No, he moved to Seattle right after we broke up. I tried to find him when I discovered I was pregnant, but he'd already left, and this was before social media made it easy to track people down." She sighed. "After Robert agreed to raise Emily as his own, it seemed best to leave the past in the past." "Well, the past is very much in the present now," Thomas said, running a hand through his dark hair so like Robert's that sometimes it hurt Catherine to look at him. "What do we do next?" Catherine didn't have an answer. For the first time in her life, she had no plan, no next steps, nothing but the ruins of her daughter's wedding day and the weight of her own decisions. Upstairs, Emily's voice had gone quiet. The silence that filled the house was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from Catherine's parents, marking the passage of time and the unraveling of carefully constructed lives. 3 weeks after what the family had taken to calling simply the incident, Emily sat in her apartment surrounded by wedding gifts she hadn't had the heart to return. Daniel had called twice, brief, awkward conversations that ended with his promise to talk soon when things are clearer. Emily wasn't sure what could possibly become clearer about her situation. Her biological father wasn't the man she'd grown up calling Dad. The man she'd planned to marry couldn't look past the deception to see that she was still the same person he'd fallen in love with. And her mother, the one constant in her life, had kept this fundamental truth from her for 26 years. The knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. She wasn't expecting anyone, and few people had visited since the wedding. That wasn't. The sympathy had been overwhelming at first. Calls, texts, flowers. But as the weeks passed, people seemed unsure how to approach her, what to say about such an unusual situation. She opened the door to find Thomas standing there, a paper bag from her favorite bakery in one hand and a determined expression on his face. "Enough wallowing," he announced, pushing past her into the apartment. "I've given you 3 weeks of solitude. Now it's time to rejoin the land of the living." Despite herself, Emily felt a smile tug at her lips. Thomas had always been like this, direct, occasionally bossy, but fiercely protective. She followed him to the kitchen, where he was already unpacking almond croissants and pouring coffee from a thermos. "I haven't been wallowing," she protested, accepting the coffee mug he handed her. "I've been processing." Thomas raised an eyebrow as he surveyed the apartment, the unwashed dishes in the sink, the wedding gifts still in their wrapping, the blanket and pillow on the couch, suggesting she'd been sleeping there rather than in her bedroom. "Right. Processing. How's that going for you?" Emily sighed and sank into a kitchen chair. "Not great. Daniel still can't decide if he wants to be with someone whose entire identity is questionable." Your identity isn't questionable," Thomas said firmly, sitting across from her. "You're Emily Matthews. You're a talented interior designer with terrible taste in reality TV and an annoying habit of singing in the shower. You're my sister. None of that has changed." Emily picked at her croissant. "But it has changed, hasn't it? I'm not a Matthews, not really. I don't even know who I am anymore." Thomas was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee. "I've been thinking about that," he finally said. "About identity and what makes us who we are. Is it our DNA, our experiences, the people who raise us?" Emily looked up, surprised by the philosophical turn. Thomas was usually more practical than reflective. "And?" she prompted. "And I think it's all of those things, but none of them defines us completely." He leaned forward. You've spent 3 weeks obsessing over the DNA part, but that's just a fraction of who you are. Most of what makes you you comes from Mom, from James, from growing up in that house on Maple Street, from me annoying the hell out of you for 26 years. Emily smiled faintly at that. "You have been exceptionally annoying." "Exactly. And I've been thinking about something else too." Thomas hesitated. "I think you should try to find him. David Winters, your biological father." Emily's heart skipped a beat. The thought had crossed her mind repeatedly over the past weeks, but it had seemed too overwhelming to contemplate. "I wouldn't even know where to start." "I would." Thomas pulled out his phone. "I've been doing some digging. David Winters, originally from Connecticut, moved to Seattle in 1998. He's an architect, apparently quite successful. He's got his own firm now, Winters Design Group." Emily stared at her brother. "You've been researching him?" Thomas nodded. "I thought you might want to know eventually, when you were ready. Does Mom know you're doing this?" "No, this isn't about Mom or Robert or anyone else. This is about you having all the information, all the pieces of yourself, so you can decide what to do with them." Emily felt a rush of gratitude for her brother. Her half-brother, technically, though the distinction seemed meaningless given the bond they shared. "Thank you," she said softly. Thomas reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "There's something else, something I haven't told anyone." He took a deep breath. "I've been in contact with Robert." Emily tensed. "Why would you do that after what he did?" Because I wanted to understand. Why now? Why at your wedding, in front of everyone? It was so deliberate, so cruel. Thomas shook his head. He's not well, Em. The drinking has gotten worse over the years. He's lost his job, his apartment. He's staying with a cousin in Pittsburgh. Am I supposed to feel sorry for him? Emily asked, though she couldn't help the twinge of pity that surfaced at Thomas's description. No. What he did was unforgivable, but I think I understand it better now. He's been carrying this resentment for 15 years, watching Mum build a new life with James, watching you grow up and succeed. The wedding was like a final straw for him, proof that everyone had moved on without him. So he decided to destroy my happiness out of spite. I think in his warped mind, he thought he was finally telling the truth, setting things right somehow. Thomas sighed. I'm not defending him. I'm just trying to make sense of it all. They sat in silence for a moment, the implications of everything settling between them. What do I do now? Emily finally asked, her voice small. That's up to you, Thomas said gently. You can try to contact David Winters or not. You can try to reconcile with Daniel or not. You can forgive Mum or not. The choice is yours. But whatever you decide, you're not alone. You have me, you have James, and you have Mum, who, despite her mistakes, loves you more than anything in this world. Emily nodded, feeling for the first time in weeks that she might eventually find her way through this maze of revelations and betrayals. I think I want to talk to Mum, she said. Really talk, without the shock and anger clouding everything. That's a good start. Thomas smiled. And maybe take a shower and change out of those sweatpants. You're starting to develop a certain aroma. Emily threw a piece of croissant at him, laughing despite herself. Get out of my apartment, you jerk! As Thomas gathered his things to leave, Emily felt a glimmer of her old self returning. The road ahead was uncertain, full of difficult conversations and decisions, but she wasn't facing it alone. And maybe, just maybe, there was something to be gained from all this pain, a fuller understanding of herself, her family, and the complex, messy truth that bound them all together. The Matthews family home looked exactly as it had 3 weeks ago, yet to Emily, it felt like entering a foreign country. She paused on the front porch, her hand hovering over the doorbell. This was the house she'd grown up in, where she'd celebrated birthdays and Christmases, where she'd brought home her first boyfriend, where she'd cried after her first heartbreak. But now it felt like a place built on shifting sand, its foundations uncertain. Before she could ring, the door opened. Catherine stood there, her face lighting up at the sight of her daughter. Emily, I was just about to call you. She hesitated, clearly unsure whether to embrace her daughter or maintain a respectful distance. Emily made the decision for her, stepping forward into her mother's arms. Whatever had happened, whatever truths had been hidden, this woman had raised her, loved her, protected her, sometimes misguided in her methods, but never in her intentions. I think we need to talk, Emily said as they separated. Really talk. Catherine nodded, ushering her into the living room. James is at a conference in Chicago. It's just us. They sat on opposite ends of the sofa, the space between them symbolic of the distance that had grown since the wedding day. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Emily began, about who I am, about family, about truth. Catherine nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. So have I. And I want you to know how deeply sorry I am, Emily. Not just for keeping the truth from you, but for how you found out. If I could go back and change it all. But you can't, Emily interrupted gently. None of us can change the past. We can only decide how to move forward. She took a deep breath. I want to know about him, about David Winters. Catherine's eyes widened slightly. How did you? Thomas told me he's been doing some research. Emily leaned forward. Tell me about him, Mom. Not just the facts, but who he was. What was he like? What parts of me might come from him? Catherine's expression softened, a distant look entering her eyes as she traveled back through time. David was brilliant, creative. He saw the world differently than anyone I'd ever met. He was studying architecture, and he would talk about buildings as if they were living things with personalities and souls. Despite herself, Emily felt a flutter of interest. As an interior designer, she'd always been drawn to the stories buildings could tell, the way spaces could evoke emotions and memories. He was tall, Catherine continued, with your green eyes and that same little crease between his eyebrows when he was concentrating. She smiled faintly. He was passionate about everything: art, music, politics. He could talk for hours about a single painting or the way light fell across a courtyard. "Why did you break up?" Emily asked. Catherine sighed. "We were young. I wanted to stay in Connecticut after graduation, close to my family. He had an opportunity in Seattle that he couldn't pass up." She shrugged. Neither of us was ready to compromise our dreams. And to be honest, it wasn't a serious relationship. We dated for about 6 months. When he left, I was sad but not heartbroken. And then you met Robert. Yes, about a month later. He was different from David, more grounded, practical. He made me laugh. We fell in love quickly. Catherine's expression clouded. "When I found out I was pregnant, I was shocked. David and I had always been careful, but there you were. And Robert agreed to raise me as his own," Emily said, still struggling to reconcile this version of her father, stepfather, with the bitter, angry man who had destroyed her wedding. "He did, and he loved you, Emily, truly. For many years, he was a wonderful father to you." Catherine reached for Emily's hand. "The problems in our marriage had nothing to do with you. They were about us, growing apart, wanting different things. And yes, Robert started drinking too much, became difficult, resentful. But none of that was because of you or because you weren't his biological child." Emily nodded, trying to absorb it all. "I've been thinking about contacting him. David Winters, I mean." Catherine didn't look surprised. "I thought you might, and I think you should, if that's what you want." "You do?" "Yes. He's a part of you, Emily, and you have a right to know him if he's open to it." Catherine squeezed Emily's hand. "I should have told you the truth years ago. I was wrong to keep it from you, even if I thought I was protecting you. You're an adult, and you deserve to know your own story." The relief Emily felt at her mother's support was overwhelming. She'd been bracing for resistance, for hurt feelings, for complications. Instead, she found understanding and a path forward. "There's something else," Emily said, her voice growing stronger. "I've decided to call Daniel, to really talk, not just these awkward check-ins we've been having." "Oh?" Catherine tried to keep her tone neutral, but Emily could hear the hope in it. "I love him, Mom, and I think he loves me, but he needs to understand that while the circumstances of my birth might have been complicated, the person I am hasn't changed. I'm still the woman he proposed to." Catherine smiled, pride evident in her eyes. "You're stronger than I ever was at your age, you know that? Braver, too." Emily shook her head. "I'm just trying to be honest, with myself and with everyone else. No more secrets." As if on cue, the front door opened and Thomas called out, "Hello? Anyone home?" He appeared in the living room doorway, looking between his mother and sister with raised eyebrows. "Well, this is a good sign. No visible injuries." Emily rolled her eyes. "We're fine, Thomas. We're talking." "Good." He hesitated, then said, "Because there's something I need to talk to both of you about. Something important." There was a gravity to his tone that made both women sit up straighter. Thomas was usually the one to diffuse tension with humor, not create it. "What is it?" Catherine asked, her voice tense. Thomas took a deep breath. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the wedding. About family, about truth. Just like you said, Em." He sat down in the armchair across from them. "And I realized there's something I've been keeping to myself that I shouldn't have. Something that might change everything." Emily and Catherine exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "What now?" "The night before the wedding," Thomas began, "I had a call from Robert. He was drunk, ranting about how he was going to expose the truth at the ceremony. I thought he was just blowing off steam, like he often does when he drinks. I never imagined he'd actually go through with it. Thomas, Catherine said softly, that's not your fault. You couldn't have known. That's not all, Thomas interrupted. When he was ranting, he mentioned the DNA test, the one he waved around at the wedding. He said he'd had it done years ago, right after the divorce, to prove what he'd always suspected. Yes, that's right, Catherine confirmed. He demanded it during the divorce proceedings. It was awful, but I agreed because I thought it might give him some closure. Thomas shook his head. That's not the test he brought to the wedding, Mom. That test is 15 years old, probably long gone. The papers he said he'd done a new test recently. Emily frowned. How could he have done a new DNA test? He hasn't seen me in years. That's exactly what I asked him, Thomas said. And what he told me, I didn't believe it at first. But the more I think about it, the more it makes a horrible kind of sense. What did he say? Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked directly at his mother, his expression troubled. He said he didn't need a new sample from Emily. He said he used mine. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. Emily stared at her brother, trying to process what he was saying. But that doesn't make sense, she finally said. Using your DNA wouldn't prove anything about me. It would, Thomas said quietly, if the test wasn't a paternity test for Emily, if it was a sibling test for us. Catherine's face had gone pale. What are you saying, Thomas? I'm saying that Robert did a sibling DNA test using my sample, and the results showed that Emily and we're full siblings, not half siblings. Thomas's gaze never left his mother's face. We have the same father, Mom. And according to that test, it's not David Winters. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly in the silence that followed Thomas's revelation. Catherine sat frozen, her mind racing through years of memories, calculations, possibilities. That's not possible, she finally whispered. Robert is your father, Thomas. And David is Emily's. Thomas leaned forward, his expression gentle but firm. The DNA doesn't lie, Mom. Either Robert is father to both of us, or neither of us. Emily's mind was whirling. But you look so much like him, Thomas. Everyone always said so. Coincidence, maybe. Or selective observation. People see what they expect to see. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. Dark like Robert's, yes, but also like Catherine's. When Robert called me that night, raving about the DNA test, I thought he was just drunk and confused. But then he showed up at the wedding with those papers, and the way he was so confident, so triumphant. Why didn't you say something sooner? Emily asked. I needed to be sure, so I did my own test, one of those home DNA kits that tells you about your ancestry. Thomas pulled out his phone and scrolled to a photo. Look. Catherine and Emily leaned in to see the screen, which showed two DNA profiles side by side, Thomas Matthews and Emily Matthews, with a 50% genetic match. Full siblings, Thomas confirmed. Not half. Catherine sank back against the sofa, her face ashen. I don't understand. Robert and I were exclusive. And David and it was only for those 6 months in college. Thomas's voice was gentle. Is there any possibility, any at all, that the timing could have been different than you remember? That there could have been some overlap? Catherine was already shaking her head before he finished the question. No. David left for Seattle in May. I met Robert in late June. I found out I was pregnant in August. She pressed her fingers to her temples. I was sure the baby, Emily, was David's because of the timing. It never even occurred to me that she could be Robert's. What about the other possibility? Emily asked quietly. That Thomas isn't Robert's son either? The question hung in the air, almost too explosive to contemplate. Catherine had been married to Robert when Thomas was conceived. There had never been any question of his paternity. Catherine began, then stopped, a distant memory surfacing. Wait. Emily and Thomas exchanged glances as their mother closed her eyes, seemingly lost in thought. David came back, Catherine said slowly, her eyes still closed as if watching a movie play out in her mind. Just once, about 4 years after he left. He was in Connecticut visiting family, and he looked me up. She opened her eyes, looking between her children. Robert and I were having problems. Our first real rough patch. He'd taken a job that required a lot of travel, and I was lonely, frustrated. When David called, I agreed to meet him for coffee. And, Thomas prompted when she fell silent. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into drinks. We talked for hours, catching up on our lives. He was still single, still passionate about architecture. I told him about you, Emily. Showed him a picture. He was surprised, of course, but not angry. More wistful, I think, about what might have been. Did you tell him I was his daughter? Emily asked. Catherine shook her head. No, I couldn't bring myself to. Robert was your father in every way that mattered, and I didn't want to complicate your life. She sighed. In retrospect, so many of my decisions were about avoiding complications, avoiding difficult truths. I thought I was protecting everyone, but maybe I was just protecting myself. What happened with David that night? Thomas asked, bringing them back to the crucial question. Catherine's cheeks flushed slightly. I was vulnerable, unhappy in my marriage. David was familiar, safe in a way. We spent the night together, just that once. He left the next day, back to Seattle, and we never spoke again. She looked at Thomas, her eyes wide with sudden realization. It was about a month later that I discovered I was pregnant with you. The implications of what she was saying settled over the room like a heavy blanket. So Thomas could be David's son, too, Emily said slowly. We could be full siblings because we share the same father, David Winters, not Robert. Catherine nodded, looking shell-shocked. It's possible. I never even considered. I was married to Robert. We were trying to work things out. When I found out I was pregnant, we were both so happy. It seemed like a new start for our marriage. Did Robert ever suspect? Thomas asked. No. At least he never said anything. The timing worked for us being together, and you were born right on your due date. There was never any reason to question it. Catherine pressed her hands to her face. God, what a mess I've made of everything. Emily moved closer to her mother, putting an arm around her shoulders. You didn't know, Mom. You couldn't have known. But I should have been honest from the beginning. With all of you. With myself. Catherine looked up at Thomas. What about the test Robert brought to the wedding? Do you have it? Thomas nodded. He left it behind in all the chaos. I kept it. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded set of papers. I've been carrying it around, trying to decide what to do. Catherine took the papers with trembling hands and skimmed through them. It's a sibling DNA test, all right. And it confirms what you said. You and Emily share the same father. So where does this leave us? Emily asked, her voice steady, despite the emotional earthquake reshaping her understanding of her family. Thomas leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Well, it means Robert was right about one thing. He's not your biological father, Em, but he was wrong about everything else. He thought he was exposing Mom's lie, but he was actually exposing a truth none of us knew. David Winters, Catherine said softly, the name hanging in the air between them. The father of both my children. Emily felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The revelation that Thomas was her full brother rather than her half-brother didn't change their relationship. They had always been close, always been siblings in every way that mattered. But it did change her understanding of herself, of her place in the family narrative. I still want to find him, she said firmly. Now more than ever. Thomas nodded. I think I do too, if he's really my biological father. He trailed off, looking thoughtful. It explains some things, actually. I never felt like I fit with Robert's family. His brothers and father were all practical, business-minded. I was always the odd one out with my interest in art and literature. Catherine reached for her son's hand. You get that from me too, you know. Not everything about you comes from your father, biological or otherwise. I know, Mum. Thomas squeezed her hand. And neither of us blames you. We understand you were doing the best you could in a complicated situation. Emily nodded in agreement. The past is the past. We can't change it, but we can decide what to do now, together, as a family. She turned to her mother. Would you be okay with us contacting David? Would that be too difficult for you? Catherine considered the question carefully. It would be strange, but no, not too difficult. It's been over 30 years since we were together, and almost 26 since that one night. Whatever feelings I had for him are long in the past. She looked between her children. If meeting him would help you both understand yourselves better, then I support it completely. The conversation was interrupted by the chime of Emily's phone. She glanced at the screen and her heart skipped a beat. It's Daniel, she said. Take it, Thomas urged. We'll be right here. Emily nodded gratefully and stepped into the kitchen for privacy, her hands slightly trembling as she answered the call. Hello? Emily. Daniel's voice was familiar and dear, sending a pang through her chest. I've been doing a lot of thinking. Me too, she said, leaning against the counter for support. Daniel, there's so much I need to tell you. Can I come over? He interrupted. To your mom's, I mean. Thomas told me you'd be there today. I think we need to talk in person. Emily's pulse quickened. Yes, please come. After ending the call, she returned to the living room, where Catherine and Thomas were engaged in quiet conversation. Daniel's on his way here, she announced. He wants to talk. Thomas stood up. That's my cue to make myself scarce. I've got some work to finish up anyway. He hugged Emily tightly. Call me later. Let me know how it goes. She nodded against his shoulder. Thank you, Tom, for everything. After Thomas left, Catherine began tidying the living room, a nervous habit Emily recognized from childhood. Her mother always cleaned when she was processing difficult emotions. Mom, Emily said gently, stilling her hands. It's going to be okay. We're going to be okay. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. I'm so proud of you, Emily. Your strength, your compassion. I don't deserve your forgiveness. There's nothing to forgive, Emily said firmly. You protected me, loved me, raised me to be the person I am. That's what matters. She squeezed her mother's hands. Now, can you give me and Daniel some privacy when he gets here? I think we have a lot to sort through. Catherine nodded, wiping away her tears. Of course. I'll be upstairs if you need me. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Emily's heart pounded as she opened the door to find Daniel standing there, looking as handsome and familiar as ever, though there were shadows under his eyes, suggesting he hadn't been sleeping well. Hi, she said simply. Hi. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Can I come in? She stepped aside to let him pass, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne as he moved past her. They settled in the living room, the space between them on the sofa, a physical manifestation of the distance that had grown since the wedding day. I've missed you, Daniel said abruptly, breaking the tense silence. Emily's breath caught. I've missed you too. I've been an idiot, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. Walking away from you like that, letting Robert's announcement change how I felt about you, about us. It was a shock, Emily acknowledged. For all of us. Daniel nodded. Yes, but that's not an excuse. I should have stayed by your side, supported you. Instead, I let my pride and my confusion drive me away from the woman I love. He reached for her hand. Can you forgive me? Emily felt tears welling in her eyes. Yes, she whispered. But Daniel, there's more you need to know. Things have evolved since the wedding. Carefully, she laid out everything she had learned that day, about Thomas's discovery, about the DNA test, about the possibility that both she and Thomas shared the same biological father in David Winters. Daniel listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful with each revelation. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. So, Robert isn't either of your biological father, he finally said. Emily nodded. It seems that way, though we'll need a more thorough DNA test to be completely certain. And how do you feel about all this? The question was so simple, yet so profound. How did she feel? Emily had been so caught up in the revelations, in managing her mother's guilt and Thomas's discoveries that she had barely had time to process her own emotions. "Honestly, I feel relieved in a way," she admitted. "Relieved that Thomas and I are full siblings. Relieved that there's an explanation that makes sense, and curious, very curious about David Winters and what parts of him might be in me." She paused, considering. "But mostly I feel like I'm still me. My identity isn't defined by whose DNA I carry, but by the people who loved me, who shaped me, who are still here with me now." Daniel's face softened. "That's one of the things I've always loved about you, you know. Your ability to find clarity in chaos, to see what really matters. And what matters to me is us," Emily said, squeezing his hand. "If you still want there to be an us." "I do," Daniel said without hesitation. "More than anything. I want to reschedule the wedding, if you'll still have me. I want to build a life with you, Emily, regardless of who your biological father is or isn't." The relief that washed over Emily was so intense, she felt lightheaded. "I'd like that," she whispered, "but maybe we should take things a bit slower this time. I want to find David first, to understand that part of my history before we start our future together." Daniel nodded. "Of course. Whatever you need. I'm not going anywhere this time, I promise." As they sealed that promise with a tender kiss, Emily felt the pieces of her shattered world beginning to realign, not in the same pattern as before, but in a new configuration that felt somehow more honest, more solid, more true. The Seattle skyline glittered beneath a rare, clear sky as Emily, Thomas, and Catherine stood outside the glass-fronted offices of Winters Design Group. 3 months had passed since the revelations that had reshaped their understanding of their family. 3 months of careful emails, phone calls, and finally an invitation from David Winters to meet in person. "Are you ready for this?" Thomas asked, adjusting his tie nervously. Emily nodded, though her stomach was in knots. "As ready as I'll ever be." Catherine stood slightly apart from her children, her face a mask of composed dignity, despite the emotional complexity of the moment. "Remember," she said quietly, "whatever happens in there, we're still a family. That doesn't change." The receptionist, forewarned of their arrival, greeted them warmly and led them through a series of sleek, modern offices to a conference room with a stunning view of Puget Sound. And there, waiting for them, was David Winters. Emily's first impression was of height. He stood well over 6 feet tall. His hair was silver now, but his eyes were the same vivid green as hers and Thomas's, and they crinkled at the corners when he smiled, just as Thomas's did. He wore a well-tailored grey suit that spoke of success without ostentation, and his hands, when he stepped forward to greet them, were those of someone who still sketched and created despite his executive position. "Catherine," he said, his voice warm with recognition as he took her hand. "It's been a long time." "It has," she agreed, her composure intact despite the strangeness of the situation. "Thank you for agreeing to meet us." David's gaze shifted to Emily and Thomas, and Emily saw the wonder in his expression, the search for resemblances, the attempt to reconcile these adult strangers with the knowledge that they were his biological children. "Emily," he said, reaching for her hand. "And Thomas. I can't tell you how many times I've looked at your photos, read your emails, tried to prepare myself for this moment." He shook his head slightly. "Nothing could have prepared me, though. You both have my mother's eyes." The simple observation broke the ice, and soon they were seated around the conference table, cups of coffee before them, talking with increasing ease. "I want you both to know," David said after the initial pleasantries had been exchanged, "that I had no idea about either of you." He looked at Catherine. "If I had known, it wouldn't have changed anything," Catherine said gently. "You had your life in Seattle. I had mine in Connecticut. We were young, with different paths ahead of us." David nodded, accepting her version of events with grace. "Still, I wish I had known. I would have wanted to be part of your lives in some way." "You can be now," Thomas said, "if you want to be." "I do," David said without hesitation. very much. Though I understand this is all new, all strange, we'll need to take time to get to know each other, to figure out what kind of relationship works for all of us." The conversation flowed more easily after that. David showed them around his office, pointing out projects he was particularly proud of. Emily found herself drawn to his architectural models, noticing how the interior spaces were designed to complement the overall structure. "You have a good eye," David commented, watching as she examined a residential project he was working on. "She's an interior designer," Thomas explained. "One of the best in Connecticut." David's face lit up. "Are you really? That's remarkable." "Is it?" Emily asked. "Or just genetics?" "Perhaps a bit of both," David said thoughtfully. "My mother was an artist. She painted landscapes mostly. And my grandfather was a furniture maker. Creativity runs in the family, it seems." And as the tour continued, Emily found herself relaxing, seeing glimpses of herself and Thomas in this man who was, biologically at least, their father. His passion for his work, his attention to detail, the way he gestured when explaining a concept, all echoed traits she recognized in herself and her brother. Later, over lunch at a waterfront restaurant, the conversation turned more personal. "I never married," David told them. "Came close once in my early 40s, but it didn't work out. My work became my life in many ways." He smiled ruefully. "I always wondered what it would be like to have a family. Now I find I've had one all along, just without knowing it." "Do you regret it?" Thomas asked. "Not having a more conventional family life?" David considered the question carefully. "I regret not knowing you both, yes, but I don't regret the path my life took. I've been fortunate in my career, in my friendships. And now, unexpectedly, I have this chance to know my children, adult children, with lives and personalities already fully formed." He looked between Emily and Thomas. "It's a gift I never anticipated." "We feel the same way," Emily said sincerely. "Getting to know you has helped us understand parts of ourselves better." As lunch concluded, David hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking about what comes next. I'd like to visit Connecticut, if that would be all right. See where you both grew up, meet your—" He glanced at Catherine. "Meet James and Emily, your fiancé, Daniel." "We'd like that," Emily said, touched by his desire to know more about their lives. "And I have something for you both," David continued, reaching into his briefcase. He pulled out 2 small wrapped packages. "Just a small token, something to remember today by." Emily and Thomas unwrapped their gifts to find identical silver pocket watches, clearly antique with intricate engravings on the cases. "They belonged to my grandfather, your great-grandfather," David explained. "He had 3 sons, and each received one of these watches when they turned 21. The third was meant for my father, but he died in Vietnam before he could receive it. My grandfather gave it to me instead." He smiled softly. "I've kept them all these years, not knowing who I would pass them on to. Now I know." The gesture, so simple yet so meaningful, brought tears to Emily's eyes. These watches represented a lineage she hadn't known she was part of, a history that was, in some small way, hers. "Thank you," she said, running her finger over the engraved surface. "This means more than you know." The day concluded with promises to stay in touch, to arrange David's visit to Connecticut, to continue building whatever this new relationship might become. As they said their goodbyes outside David's office building, Catherine hung back slightly, allowing Emily and Thomas a moment alone with him. "It was good to see you again, Catherine," David said as she stepped forward to say goodbye. "You raised 2 remarkable people. You should be very proud." "I am," she said simply. "And I'm glad they found you. That we all did." The flight back to Connecticut was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts about the day, about the man they had met, about the new understanding of their family that was still taking shape. 2 weeks later, Emily stood in her apartment, surveying the half-packed boxes scattered around her. She and Daniel had found a house, a charming colonial not far from her mother's place, with plenty of room for the future they were planning together. Their wedding was rescheduled for the spring, a smaller, more intimate affair than the first attempt. The doorbell rang, and Emily opened it to find Daniel standing there, a bouquet of white lilies in his hand, the same flowers she had carried at their almost wedding. "For you," he said, presenting them with a flourish, "to celebrate new beginnings." Emily took the flowers, inhaling their sweet scent. "They're beautiful. Thank you." "How are you feeling about everything?" Daniel asked as they settled on the couch among the packing boxes. "Meeting David? Reconnecting with your mom? Planning the wedding again?" Emily considered the question. "Surprisingly good," she said. "It's like all these pieces that never quite fit together before have finally found their proper places. My relationship with my mom is stronger than it's ever been. Thomas and I have always been close, but now there's this new dimension to our connection. And David," she smiled, "he's coming for Thanksgiving. James is already planning the menu." "And Robert?" Daniel asked carefully. Emily's expression sobered. "Thomas is still in touch with him. He's in rehab now, trying to get better. I'm not ready to see him yet, but I'm not holding on to anger either. His actions hurt me deeply, but they also led to all these truths coming out, to this new understanding of who I am." Daniel nodded, reaching for her hand. "And who are you, Emily Matthews, now that the dust has settled?" Emily interlaced her fingers with his, feeling the weight of the engagement ring she had recently put back on. "I'm the daughter of Catherine Matthews, who loved me enough to protect me, even when her methods were flawed. I'm the sister of Thomas Matthews, who had the courage to seek the truth even when it was difficult. I'm the biological daughter of David Winters, whose creativity and passion for design runs in my blood." So she smiled at Daniel. "And I'm the future wife of Daniel Hayes, who came back to me when it mattered most." "That's quite an identity," Daniel said, smiling. "It is," Emily agreed. "But most importantly, I'm just me, Emily. All the parts of my past, all the people who've shaped me, they're important, but they don't define me completely. I get to decide who I am every day, with every choice I make." Daniel leaned in to kiss her gently. "Well, I think you're pretty extraordinary, whoever you decide to be." As the autumn sunlight streamed through the apartment windows, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey had been unexpected, often painful, but ultimately transformative. The shattering of her old understanding of family had led to a new, stronger foundation, one built not on secrets and assumptions, but on truth and acceptance. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "David just sent flight details for Thanksgiving. Mum's already planning where to put him. This should be interesting." Emily smiled, texting back, "Family always is." And in that simple exchange was everything she had learned these past months. That family was complex, messy, and often surprising, but always, always worth fighting for. Before we part ways, I'd like to thank you for joining me on this emotional journey. If you enjoyed this story of family secrets and reconciliation, please consider subscribing to our channel for more captivating narratives. Don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue bringing these touching stories to life.